Janusz Walus is due to be released on parole by no later than tomorrow. That's within the 10 days stipulated by the Constitutional Court last week, when it ruled that Chris Hani's assassin should indeed get parole. But with Walus now recovering from a prison stabbing and renewed fears about how safe he will be while serving his parole, what must Correctional Services consider before he's released? Well, let's discuss this now with two people from Nicro, which is a non-profit organisation that specialises in offender rehabilitation and reintegration. Magda Reynolds is the Nicro Western Cape area manager. Donne Williams is the program developer. Good evening to both of you. Thank you so much for joining us. So I'm going to start with you, Magda. So could you just give us the basic, typical requirements that Correctional Services normally considers when releasing someone on parole? I mean, do they have to make sure the person has a job, for example?
So the person needs to have a place to stay, a support system. They need to have been prepped for release psychologically. So they need to have gone through preparation sessions as well. And in determining whether the person is eligible or not, that would look like what part of their sentence have they served, what does the law make provision for, do they show remorse for their actions, do they feel that reparation has now been made and they are ready to re-enter society? And then obviously psychological preparation with them, because the environment is a lot different inside and outside, preparation with the community they're going to release him to, and then also with the family or caretakers that they will be staying at. They can't necessarily guarantee employment because, you know, that is a whole topic on its own to get people with a criminal record employment, but very much stable address at least, and a place where they can be safely released to.
All right. So, Donne, I want to bring you in here. When you're dealing with a parolee who is at risk, someone who other people might want dead, for example, is there provision for keeping the whereabouts of parolees safe? I mean, almost like a witness protection, but a parolee protection program. Is there anything like that?
So DCS does most of the probation officer and correctional supervision as well. So overseeing what's happening with the parolee, and they can do constant check-ins and make sure where their whereabouts are and see how the environment is, if anything is collapsing around them to make it a more dangerous environment.
And then they will also make the call as to where to move the person to that could be safe and that might not be so accessible to the public as well.
So, Magda, are you able to tell us if you've dealt with any cases where a parolee is at risk, either, you know, because of your concern about their psychological state or perhaps risk from external actors, and how you deal with a person like that?
Look, if a person is psychologically a threat to themselves, you are obligated mental health-wise to keep them in counseling, whether that be they start receiving those sessions inside and continue them outside, and that they are then more stringently checked upon. Once a person is released, obviously, doing those checks can become part of their parole conditions, because you want the person not to be a risk to themselves or to others. If it shows that they're a risk to others, then they actually can't be paroled, because then they're a safety to society again. If they are facing a risk from the community, then obviously DCS would have checks and balances in place to see where this person could be placed, safe house-wise, where they would actually be safe.
Have you ever come across a situation before, Magda, where someone about to get parole is attacked in prison just beforehand?
It is something that happens sometimes, that we have had reports of, and then obviously their medical care needs to take precedent over the release. So either they need to then recover to a space where they can be released inside, or there can always be provision made for the person to be perhaps transported to a state hospital and recovered there. It literally depends situation to situation and how active the threat is and how bad the injuries were that were sustained.
All right. And Donne, when someone goes on parole, I mean, traditionally we think of someone who has to report to the police station once a week. But talk to me about typical parole conditions and how exactly they work.
So with parole conditions, obviously they do need to do those check-ins, but one very important element as well is to have a good rapport with the probation officer so that they actually know what's going on with the person as well. There are a few other conditions that need to be met as well. So, for example, you can't
be found guilty of another crime if you have perhaps offended in terms of children or women, and there was a restriction in place that you can't have contact with that population group. They apply very strict measures to each parolee that is based on what they were arrested for or what they were initially incarcerated with. So some of them will be standard, like you can't commit another crime, you have to check in, and then some will be tailored to the offense and the person itself.
And there's also a period where you have to be homebound as well.
I see. Okay. So Magda, final question to you, and it's looking specifically at the Walus case. We know that he was attacked in prison. He's recovering. This is a man who's been in prison for 29 years. Who's probably well aware that he's not well liked in South Africa. Talk to me a little bit about your thoughts around this particular case, because it's not a typical parole situation, is it?
No, it's not. So the problem that they will face is the fact that there is almost no community that he will be welcomed back to. So I'm assuming that from DCS's side, they applied quite a lot of, out of the box thinking when it came to where he could potentially be placed, where he would be safe. And then also, if you just think of restoration made to the community, what is it that the community would want to see from him at this point? Like, would they want him to perform additional community service? On top of the sentence that he has served, what has been happening? Because obviously community feedback is very vital in every step of this process. And then also from his side, like, what is happening for him psychologically? Because being released into a very hostile environment can also place him at risk of reoffending, which is something that will then obviously take him back to jail. So there are quite a few things that I'm sure DCS had to consider in terms of his release because of the nature of this offense and how many people it impacted in South Africa.
Yeah, it as you say, a completely unusual situation, and it's going to be very interesting to see how the Department of Correctional Services manages it, particularly because they were only given 10 days to set up a very complicated situation by the Constitutional Court. Thank you so much. That
and
was
a very
sorry, you say that? What were you saying?
No, I'm saying it's a very short time span. Usually they have, 10 plus weeks to prep an offender for release. So
it's a good point. Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Nicro's Magda Reynolds and Donne Williams, talking to us about the difficulties of this particular parole situation and how many of the aims and goals of parole are just going to be very difficult to achieve. Thank you very much for your time, ladies. Now let's